Wow, I look as tired as I feel. We just had a daylight savings, and so my whole already bad schedule is even worse than usual. I want to try something today, so I'm working on this scene, and Tom's wearing this jacket covered in lights, and they're fairly directional. And when one is shining right at the camera, you get this cool kind of distinctive star flare, and I want to see if I can replicate that with the little digital double, because this is the digital guy. It works pretty good, but I think getting some of those flares going on there might push the realism even slightly further. So yeah, we can see it again here. There's kind of the different spots, and as that one swings around to point at us, we get this nice flickering flare. It's just some cool randomness. I haven't really messed with the lens flares since like what, 2012 or something, when Video Copilot's optical flares came out for After Effects, and suddenly you were seeing fake lens flares everywhere. I was sitting in a Scott's sports bar one time. They've got the big wall of TVs, and every single commercial just had optical flares going everywhere, and I was sitting there being like, I'll bet the look of professionalism in the future is going to be less lens flares. This was in the Star Trek era, but now I kind of want to get back into it. So what I did is I took a picture of Lux holding my cell phone light in the dark. So I got a map of the lens flare of my specific lens. And actually, I got a few different lenses at different levels of exposure. Some of them seem more useful than others. But I want to be able to bleed off to black around the edges. So let's use this one. This is 686. Here we are in Blender. F3 images is planes. 686. And let's set up a camera right over it we'll be rendering from. And let's make it a square image. It'll just be 1080 square. Cool. We'll slide open the shader editor here. And so it's interesting. This is a light effect. Here, let's plug this into emission here. And the first thing you notice is if a lens flare, if an optical blowout effect isn't at 100%, if these blown out pixels aren't actually white, it looks really weird and gray. This doesn't look like it's an actual light thing. This looks, this would look like a bad comp. And so I'm wondering if there's a way we can use high dynamic range to construct a special thing that works a little bit better. I don't know. We'll find out here. Let's layer this into emission and turn the base color to black and make sure the specular and everything is off. Actually, let's just get rid of all this. We're just going to drag the color straight into the surface here. And I'm going to make the color space, the special preset I've talked about with Nathan's Color Tools. You can find them here on the Patreon and over on the GitHub. But let's see. I think I probably shot it at this. Yeah, so that linearizes the footage. We get slightly darker blacks here. Actually, let's just make the background be straight black. And now if I put a color mix node here, I should be able to multiply it by different values, and that actually, because we're using a high dynamic range thing, we can actually see the flare get dimmer without just turning into gray, and that's really cool. And again, that's because we're filming in a higher dynamic range format, trying to bring it into this more limited dynamic range space. This is fun. I don't like this little grayed out area, so let's fix that by mixing in a gradient texture here. Drag the color down into that, and we'll make it a quadratic sphere, and we will remap it to be in the center here. So just -0.5, -0.5, -0.5, and put in a color ramp node here to here. Let's multiply that, and okay, that works good. Here, let's soften that up a little bit. I just don't really want to be able to see the edges. And maybe I'll just cheat the gamma just a little bit here. Turn it up to like 1.1, which again is lowering kind of the values of the mids a little bit, but preserving all of those highlights. We still have a nice flare here that we can change the brightness of without graying out too much. This is going to be comped over an actual light source, and so once it gets dim enough so that this looks not great, it should be just disappearing into the light source behind it. So I think this is going to work pretty darn well. So here, let's turn this down a little bit, uncheck denoise, hit F12. And you can see there's some of the original cell phone case in there. I'm just not going to worry about that. Here, let's save this. and I'm going to save it as an EXR. I don't actually think this image is technically high dynamic range, but just in case, open EXR, half, let's save it as a DWAB, and this is the 24 to 70 millimeter flare. All right. And this is, unfortunately, because it's one of the most important, it's also one of the first scans I did for the episode, which means I've learned so much since then, but it's still working okay. I've got the jacket that's kind of trying to do a cloth sim thing on top of, okay, yeah, it's trying to calculate as it goes. It's trying to do a cloth sim on top of everything, then I have the lights attached to that cloth sim with vertex parenting. It's all a little bit uncanny. Let's F3, images as planes, bring in our flare. And I'm going to, since I have the copy attributes add-on activated, I'm going to shift click on this and control C, copy location, copy rotation, scale it, and I can bring it up just a little bit. And, oh, I should have done this before. Here, let's grab this. Control P, parent to that light. And we'll get rid of the principled shader here, just plug this straight into the output. And typically this would be weird because like lens flares are an optical thing, which means they should always be pointing straight at the camera. Like you can't get a skewed lens flare like this. But we only want to be able to see the lens flare when we're looking straight at the light anyway. So I think it's not even going to be a problem. The first thing we want to do is add these values here to whatever's behind it. So we'll add the values of the image to a transparent with an add shader. And I want to make the color of the flare match the light behind it. So let's mix color and multiply this by something kind of orange or yellow. Yeah, that's looking good. In fact, we can make this value like 4. And okay, I can see the edges a little bit here. We can make it maybe 3. I might go in and re-render that original flare, but we'll keep going with this. And the very last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure we only see the flare when we're looking right at it by using another multiply node here, just multiplying it by black. And let's bring in a layer weight. And the layer weight will give you a value based off of the angle you're looking at the image. So here, if we just drag this over into surface, you can see what I'm talking about. It's just black right where we're looking straight at it. And we can change that value by changing the blend here. So now, the higher we bring this, the more localized that is. If we drag that down to control the mix factor of this, you can see we can only see the flare when we're really looking right at it. And here, let's actually change this to be like 9.9. So that's really localized. And yeah, look at that. Oh, it's nice and subtle. I still might cheat the gamma just a tad here. Maybe 1.2. Which means I can make the flare even a little bigger. And yeah, that totally seems to match the footage. I think that's going to add some nice little, as he's walking around, you're going to see these little glimmers and stuff going on. So I use this type of technique quite a bit. In fact, I have a asset here that I made where I rendered out a bunch of spotlights shining through volumetric haze, and I can just drag them into my scene. And they're not perfect, but I have kind of a similar thing going on where when you look at this from the side, you see this side flare, and if you get on axis, it's kind of replaced by this other flat flare. And I've been using that for headlights and stuff, just because spotlights don't actually render particularly efficiently with volumetric haze. And so I had a scene that rendered pretty fast, except for one darn spotlight where I had to crank all of the render settings to get it to work. So I'd have something like this, and just under the object properties, I turn off the visibility for volume scatter, which means it's still casting light, but it's not trying to interact with the volumetrics. And I would drag in my spotlight here, and again, using the copy attributes add-on, Control-C, copy location, copy rotation. I'm going to parent it to the light, so it does whatever this light does, scale it up a little bit. And actually, in this case, I might get rid of this plane right here. And it's still kind of weird you can get along it, but if I have a camera in the scene, I can use a locked track constraint along the right axis. So then it will always just be facing the camera, and the camera will always see this nice view of this spotlight here. So I'll make these assets available too if you guys want. Yeah, I'll just put these in the post. They're really handy. I've been using them a lot. They're kind of better, you know, the more subtle that they are. So usually in the shader editor, I will, let's see, how do I control the brightness here? Oh, it's just probably, Yeah, I'll keep them kind of faint. This is a high dynamic range EXR, but you still again get that weird gray, unnatural feeling if you bring it down too far. So just a thing to keep in mind. Although, what are these weird art? What is this? I don't have. Oh, it's because the plane is perfectly lined up with the bottom of the volumetric space. If I offset this, that should probably fix it. That's weird. I've never run into that before. Okay, that feels more natural. So I did a test render, and it's looking pretty good. It's got like it does add that lens texture to the shot and make it match the live action stuff better. But there's kind of two issues I saw. The first one is that the lens flare is actually rotating with his arm rotation, which doesn't make any sense because lens flares are flares that happen in the lens. They don't care what the object is doing. All they care about is that it's an overbright area of the image that's creating an artifact, which also means that a lens flare always has to be composited right on top of the image. Even in big movies, sometimes I'll see like a shot where something explodes and there's a lens flare and it's composited outside of like a window. Like the flare should always be as close to your eyeball as you can possibly get it. Which is also the source of my other problem. If I actually put the lens flare at the exact source as the light, it's clipping through all of the geometry and looking really weird. So what I did is I brought it out to the foreground here and kind of just hand keyframed it trying to match the light source, which, considering everything else is fairly automatic, was a little bit annoying. So let's easily fix both of those things really fast. And I've got this oscillating object with the lens flare parented to it, and right now the flare is rotating with the object, which doesn't make any sense. We want the flare to actually rotate with the lens of the camera, and we can fix that really easily. Here, let's select the flare, go into the Constraints tab, and create a copy rotation constraint. We select the camera. And right now it'll be kind of weird because whatever the camera does, the flare is also going to do, which results in some weird behaviors. But we can turn off a couple of these axes so it only cares about copying on this rotation here. And suddenly everything's behaving exactly as you would expect. Even if we kind of go offset a little bit, it's still just going to be mostly working. So that fixes the first one, nice and easy. So right now I have the flare kind of lined up with the light source, but it only works from the camera. In reality, it's floating in the foreground here in front of the light, because if it's actually on the light, here, let's shift click this, copy location, copy rotation, and control P parent. You can see it clips into the light, it clips into his backpack, and it just looks really weird. So what we want to do is put the flare just on top of everything else. And we can do this really easily with view layers or render layers or like render passes. If you're watching this video, you're probably already familiar with the concept. I never used them because I think when I tried 12 years ago, I thought they were confusing, and so I just wrote them off. But they're actually really easy, and they're a great thing to use, so let's do that right now. We're going to have two render layers. One is going to render everything but the flare, and the other one's going to render just the lens flare on black on its own, so it doesn't have any geometry it can intersect with, and then Blender will composite them on top, and it'll just spit out a single EXR with all of it as if it was rendered that way to begin with. So let's get that started. You'll see right here in the outliner, we are actually by default in the View Layer tab. When you're checking all these boxes, turning on the visibilities, you're actually just adjusting the settings of the default view layer, which is called View Layer. So let's call this one Everything But the Flare. Great. Then I'm going to select this lens flare here and hit M, New Collection, and I'm going to call it Flare. And you can see that pops up here. And we can just turn that off for the Everything But the Flare layer. Let's create a new render layer here by clicking this button, New. And this one we'll call Flare. And there's all this weird stuff in here. I don't even know what most of that is. It doesn't matter, because I'm going to turn off everything here except for the flare object. And we actually have more settings over here under the View Layers tab, which, again, for some reason, I hardly ever use, though I'm going to try to change that. But we've got all these different specific passes we can get. But what I'm interested in is down here under Filter. You can actually check what is included in the render pass. Like, say we had an HDRI environment. Yeah, like that. What we want is the lens flare on black so we can easily composite it. So under the View Layers tab, we can just uncheck Environment, and it'll render it on black. But here, let's turn this off, set everything back to 0. Okay, so we have our render passes set up. When we hit render, it's going to render twice. It's going to render everything, then it's going to render the flare, but it doesn't know what to do with them. So let's hop over into the compositor here, and if we check Use Nodes, you can see already by default it has that original view layer going into the composite output. And if we duplicate this, we can use this pull down and see we also have the flare layer available. We just want to put one on top of the other, so I'm going to add a mix color node here, put them both in there, and change the mix to add, and it'll just add the pixel values of the flare to the environment. So yeah, when we hit render, it should automatically do everything. It's rendered the flare, and now put them together. There we go. We've got him. He's got the flare going. It automatically saves it to the EXR. This render doesn't look great because the reflections here are weird because Blender 4.0 renders things differently. I'm gonna have to redo a bunch of materials, I think. So yeah, I think that's gonna work great. Inversely, what if you did want the flare to be obscured by something? You wanted geometry to be able to block it. Well, that just means you'd probably... you might be able to do something with some clever geometry nodes raycasting setup. That's beyond me right now. So what I would do is I would just hand keyframe, you know, the scale of the flare to make it go to 0 and then kind of bring it back when the occlusion stopped. And another thing I was kind of messing with that I couldn't figure out, I don't even know if it's possible. It still bugs me a little bit that like as the flare rotates around with the light, you can kind of see a little bit of the perspective on it. Like it should just be this flat two-dimensional thing in the lens. So I was trying to see if you could use the window texture coordinate mapping node and like use the incoming ray data to normalize that so it was always perfectly centered on the origin, and so you'd still get that normal data for like the visibility, but it would also just be flat. But I think I don't know if stuff works like that. Anyways, I will upload all these different flares in a little asset pack. You can just load them in from the asset browser or copy and paste them in. They should all behave like how they look in the video. I'm excited. I'm starting to put these flares into other shots, and it's bringing everything together. Yeah, I think I was too hard on lens flares. Lens flares are great. I want to get back into lens flares again. So re-rendered it with those changes, and yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. And I think it's a good proof of concept for like being able to put this stuff other places. This one's maybe overdoing it, but I like being able to bring the actual lens's flare into the scene. I think that adds quite a bit. So yeah, I'll upload this stuff into an asset pack somewhere in the post, and hopefully that's useful for somebody. And yeah, I will talk to you soon. I want to try to do some kind of smaller, goofier videos because again, I keep overthinking everything. But well, yeah. All right, have a good one.